Welcome! You're listening to the Uncharted Lancaster podcast, where we explore the hidden histories, forgotten places, and long-buried secrets of Lancaster County. Using modern digital storytelling tools, each episode brings a new piece of local lore to life, revealing the strange, the surprising, and the stories history left behind. Let's begin.
You know, when we picture the American Revolution, we tend to visualize these really clean, majestic paintings.
Right, like Washington standing perfectly tall in a rowboat crossing the Delaware.
Exactly. Or the elegant signing of the Declaration. We have this expectation that military masterstrokes are like a brilliant chess match.
Oh, for sure. You move your knight, you trap the king, and centuries later, historians point at the map and say, well, there it is, pure genius.
Yeah. It's comforting to think of it that way. We inherently want to believe that the people shaping world history always operated with, absolute clarity.
Executing these perfectly fictionless, almost mathematical plans.
But then you step into the late summer of 1777.
Oh, yeah. Suddenly, that pristine, hypothetical chessboard is covered in knee-deep mud, pouring rain, and the deafening apocalyptic screech of millions of cicadas.
It's a tactical landscape that is honestly just baffling. It's an absolute mess of conflicting strategies and really bizarre decisions.
It is the defining strategic paradox of the entire war. It's a monumental gamble by the British Empire that entirely defies basic, conventional military logic.
I want you, listening to this right now, to just picture the scene. It's the peak of summer, August 1777. Imagine the absolute largest armada the North American continent had ever seen up to that point in human history.
We're talking about over 260 warships and transports.
Right. And they're carrying 17,000 highly trained professional soldiers. And they're sailing on a grueling, miserable 500-mile detour out into the open Atlantic Ocean.
All the way down the American coast and then slowly creeping back up the Chesapeake Bay.
Just to avoid some underwater swikes in a river.
It is a stunning visual, really, and the sheer scale of it is almost hard to comprehend in an era before, steam power or modern logistics.
And the prize they were enduring all of this suffering for, Philadelphia.
The capital city of the newly declared and fiercely rebellious United States of America.
So we all know the greatest hits of the Revolution, right? If you took high school history, 1776, the Liberty Bell, the Declaration of Independence.
The freezing, bloody footprints in the snow at Valley Forge later on.
Right, but today's deep dive is zeroing in on this crucial, completely bizarre middle chapter. This is the watershed moment in 1777 that actually connects those famous events.
It's the British invasion of Delaware.
Which is a fascinating and honestly wildly overlooked campaign.
We are going to trace the muddy, bloody, and just exhausting march that ultimately set the stage for the massive Battle of the Brandywine.
And the fall of the American capital. And to do that, we are leaning on some truly incredible historical legwork.
If you're a fan of the American Revolution podcast, you might know they did a spectacular multi-part deep dive into the granular movements of this exact campaign.
Yeah, and historians Gerald J. Kaufman and Michael R. Gallagher wrote this definitive microscopic look at the troop movements called The British Invasion of Delaware, August to September, 1777.
What blows my mind about this research is that it's not just generals moving flags on a map.
No, exactly. You get the sweeping macro strategy, sure, but it's anchored by these visceral daily diary entries from the actual people stuck in the mud.
The primary sources are what make this specific campaign so captivating. We have the journals of British commanders, the diaries of Hessian mercenaries.
Guys who had absolutely no idea what kind of alien landscape they had just stepped into.
Right. And the letters of the American troops desperately trying to stop them. It completely strips away the mythology.
It leaves you with the brutal, exhausting reality of an 18th century invasion. Which brings us to the Howe brothers and their incredibly agonizing strategic end run.
Because if you're a British general looking at a map in the summer of 1777, the board is actually pretty complicated.
It is. So let's set the strategic table for a second. The previous year, 1776, had been disastrous for the Americans right up until the very end.
Yeah, when Washington pulled off those miracle victories at Trenton and Princeton.
So now, it's the summer of 1777. George Washington's Continental Army has spent the winter and spring basically surviving in the Watchung Mountains near Morristown, New Jersey.
Which is a brilliant defensive position. From those heights, they can essentially look down and monitor the British forces.
Forces that are occupying Manhattan Island and the surrounding areas of New York, right? So it's this massive staring contest.
The British commanders are General William Howe, who is in charge of all the land forces, and his older brother, Admiral Richard Howe.
And he commands the absolute dominance of the Royal Navy. So they look at the situation and decide it's time to cut the head off the snake.
They want Philadelphia. It's the largest city in the colonies, it's the biggest port, and it's the political heart of the rebellion.
That's where the Continental Congress is sitting, precisely. Now, if you look at a map of the East Coast, getting an army from New York to Philadelphia is not like an insurmountable task.
There are really only two conventional options. Option A is the direct land route. You march your army across the state of New Jersey, cross the Delaware River, and walk right into the city.
Okay, and option B?
Option B is the direct sea route. You load your men onto ships, sail a relatively short distance down the New Jersey coastline, enter the mouth of the Delaware Bay, and sail straight up the Delaware River right to the docks of Philadelphia.
Sounds simple enough, but the Howe brothers don't do either of those things.
No, they don't. They look at option A, the land route, and realize that means marching 17,000 men through New Jersey, which is swarming with angry local militias.
And they'd have to fight straight through Washington's entrenched army. General Howe has absolutely no appetite for a brutal war of attrition in the New Jersey forests.
So they look at option B, sailing up the Delaware River.
But Washington and his engineers haven't just been sitting around, have they? They spent the entire summer turning the Delaware River into a literal death trap.
They absolutely did. The Americans understood that the Royal Navy was the most powerful force on the planet. You cannot beat them in a fair fight on open water.
So you don't fight fair.
Exactly. The Americans built a series of mutually supporting forts along the riverbanks, heavily armed with artillery. But more importantly, they choked the navigational channels by laying down lines of chevaux de frise.
Okay, I'm obsessed with these things. For anyone who hasn't encountered the term, explain the mechanics of a chevaux de frise, because it sounds like a delicate French pastry.
Right, but it's actually a terrifying weapon of war. The term translates roughly to Frisian horses, which dates back to medieval anti-cavalry obstacles.
But in a naval context in 1777.
Think of them as giant underwater tank traps. The Americans would take massive, incredibly thick timber frames, basically the trunks of huge oak or pine trees.
Okay.
They would construct these heavy boxed frames and fill the bottom with tons of stone to act as an anchor.
Right, so they sink to the bottom of the river.
Exactly. But protruding upward from these sunken frames, angled just slightly downstream, were massive, heavy wooden beams tipped with lethal iron spikes.
And here's the genius part, right? They engineered them so that the iron tips rested just barely below the surface of the muddy water at high tide.
Yes. They were completely invisible to an approaching ship.
It's a marine minefield, but using pure physics instead of explosives.
Precisely. If you're a heavy British warship and you are sailing upriver, the tide and the wind are pushing you forward with incredible momentum.
And if you strike one of those iron-tipped spikes hidden just below the water,
it acts like a giant can opener. The momentum of the multi-ton ship drives the stationary iron spike straight through the wooden hull, instantly breaching the ship below the waterline.
Oh, wow.
The water rushes in and the ship sinks almost immediately, right in the middle of the river's narrowest channels.
Which creates yet another obstacle for the ships behind it.
Exactly. And as Kaufman and Gallagher note in their research, these things were built so durably that an intact, beautifully preserved chevaux de frise was actually pulled out of the Delaware River mud in 2007.
Wait, really?
Yes. 230 years later, the iron spike was still there.
That is wild. So on July 30th, the mighty British fleet actually arrives at the mouth of the Delaware Bay. But the HMS Roebuck, which had been patrolling the area, sends word to the Howe brothers.
They say, look, the river is stacked with shore batteries, fire ships, and these invisible wooden spikes.
And General Howe looks at this and just says, nope, turn the boats around.
This is the moment that defines the entire campaign. General Howe is a commander who is psychologically devoted to the flanking maneuver.
Right, he deeply prefers to outsmart his opponent by going around them, rather than grinding through a bloody frontal assault.
He had used this exact philosophy to devastating effect against Washington at the Battle of Long Island the previous year. He completely outflanked the Americans and nearly destroyed the entire Continental Army.
He's chasing that high. He wants another brilliant maneuver.
He does. So he applies that tactical preference on a grand continental scale. He deduces, if the front door through New Jersey is locked by Washington's army,
And the side door up the Delaware River is heavily booby-trapped with spikes.
he will simply sail his armada hundreds of miles out of the way to come down the chimney.
It's a 500-mile detour. They decide to sail south, down the coast, around Cape Charles at the tip of Virginia, and then slowly navigate all the way up the Chesapeake Bay to land in Maryland.
It's like you're driving from New York to Philly, and there's traffic on the turnpike, so you decide to detour through Ohio.
That is the perfect analogy. And the cost of this so-called brilliant flank is absolutely horrific.
The physical toll on the British Army cannot be overstated here. We have to look at the timeline and the logistics.
Okay, let's break it down.
They load these troops onto the ships in New York on July 23rd. Because of contrary winds, brutal weather, and the agonizingly slow pace of moving a 260-ship armada.
They don't anchor at the head of the Chesapeake Bay until August 22nd.
That is an entire month. 4 weeks locked in the belly of 18th century wooden ships.
And consider the environmental conditions. It is the absolute peak of the Atlantic summer heat.
Oh, it was miserable. The holds of these ships were not designed for long-term passenger comfort. They were designed for cargo. They're essentially floating, unventilated ovens.
You have 17,000 soldiers, plus thousands of sailors and crew members, crammed shoulder to shoulder below decks.
The diaries from the ships are basically horror stories. They are writing about how the heat is so intense that the pitch sealing the deck planks is melting.
Melting and literally dripping down on them in the dark.
Exactly. The food they packed in New York is spoiling. The fresh water they stored in wooden casks is turning green and foul.
Scurvy is breaking out.
Yeah.
Dysentery is sweeping through the ranks.
And it wasn't just the human suffering. An army of that era relies completely on horsepower for logistics, for artillery movement, for cavalry scouting.
Right, and the British loaded hundreds of horses onto these ships.
And horses cannot vomit. Biologically, if a horse gets seasick or eats bad grain, they can't purge it. They just suffer from colic and die.
Plus, you can't just have a horse standing on a rolling deck for a month. They'll break their legs.
So they have them suspended in these canvas slings below deck. The heat, the smell of ammonia, the panic of the animals.
The logistical records show that they loaded roughly 320 horses in New York. Over 160 of them, more than half of their entire cavalry and artillery capacity, died in those holds before they even saw the shores of Maryland.
They literally had to winch the rotting carcasses up and throw them into the Atlantic Ocean.
The human cost was equally grim. 27 soldiers died outright during the voyage, and hundreds, perhaps thousands more, were terribly sick.
Malnourished and bedridden by the time the fleet finally dropped anchor. Which begs the ultimate strategic question. What was the true cost-benefit analysis of Howe's strategy?
Because the journey to Maryland took almost as long as a typical, brutal transatlantic crossing from Britain to America.
Okay, I have to stop here because this is where my modern brain just short-circuits. It's like spending a month setting up the ultimate home security system on your front doors, and the burglar just quietly unhinges your back gate while you're standing there holding a bat.
Except the burglar in this case is starving himself to death to do it.
Right. Let me get this straight. To avoid fighting some local militias in New Jersey, or to avoid some wooden spikes in a river, the Howe brothers locked the finest army on Earth in floating saunas for weeks.
It sounds less like a stroke of genius and more like a massive logistical cell phone. They essentially besieged and starved their own army before the battle even started.
It is a profound, almost reckless risk. Howe is making a massive gamble. He's deliberately trading the physical fighting strength, the health, and the momentum of his army for the element of absolute surprise.
And a better positional advantage.
His theory was that by disappearing into the ocean, he would paralyze Washington. And to be fair, for several weeks it worked.
It totally worked. Washington had absolutely no idea where this massive armada had gone. He thought they might be sailing to Boston, or perhaps south to Charleston.
Right. Washington's spy network is usually great, but you can't put a spy on a ship in the middle of the ocean.
On August 21st, Washington is frantically writing dispatches saying the fleet has finally been spotted high up in the northeast part of the Chesapeake Bay. So Howe got his confusion.
But at what cost?
The cost becomes immediately apparent when they try to actually execute the landing.
On August 22nd, in the middle of a driving, miserable rainstorm, the 265 ships finally anchor at the very northern tip of the Chesapeake Bay.
Near a place called Turkey Point, Maryland.
You would think that after a month at sea, the men are cheering, the hard part is over. But getting an 18th century army off a boat turns into its own special kind of logistical nightmare.
This brings us to the muddy, chaotic beachhead at Head of Elk.
In military doctrine, an amphibious landing is historically one of the most complex, chaotic, and dangerous maneuvers in warfare.
Because you are attempting to transfer your combat power from the relative safety of a floating fortress to a completely hostile shore.
And in that transitional moment, when your men are in small boats and your cannons are suspended in midair, your forces are incredibly vulnerable. They cannot fight back.
Now, let's be clear about the geography here. If you're picturing D-Day with a wide, sandy beach, just erase that.
The sources emphasize that Head of Elk, which is modern-day Elkton, Maryland, was a tiny, obscure hamlet. The water in the Elk River wasn't deep and clear. It was shallow, tidal, and incredibly muddy.
It was so shallow that Admiral Richard Howe, the commander of the fleet, couldn't even bring his command ship close to shore.
Yes, the flagship was the HMS Eagle, a massive, heavily armed 64-cannon ship of the line. But because of its size, it drew too much water.
Its hull sat too deep to navigate the silty bottom of the Elk River.
According to the meticulous diary of Hessian Captain Friedrich von Munchausen, who served as an aide-de-camp to General Howe, the admiral literally had to abandon his own flagship.
At 5 o'clock in the morning, in the pouring rain, the commander of the British Navy had to be rowed over and transfer his flag to a smaller frigate, the HMS Roebuck, just to proceed further upriver.
Just to oversee the landing. It's humiliating. The big command ship is stuck miles behind.
And the regular soldiers can't just walk off a dock. The British had designed these specific flat-bottomed boats that held about 50 troops each.
So you have these sick, emaciated soldiers wearing heavy wool uniforms, climbing down rope nets into these small boats as they bob in the water.
And then they have to be rowed for miles to the shoreline.
Now multiply that process by 15 to 17,000 soldiers. Then consider the logistics of the equipment.
They have to carefully winch tens of thousands of heavy iron cannonballs out of the holds.
They have to offload massive bronze field artillery pieces without capsizing the small boats. They have to drag the surviving terrified horses into the water and force them to swim to shore.
It was an agonizingly slow, multi-day process. Most of the army unloaded at Turkey Point, which is just a tiny, muddy ferry landing.
The mud is a crucial character in this story because it's tidal, right? When the tide goes out, you're not rowing to a beach, you're rowing into a wall of thick, sucking river mud.
Exactly. And the strategic reality here is fascinating. This was General Howe's moment of maximum existential vulnerability.
His men are sick. Their legs are weak from a month at sea. They are crammed into small wooden boats, and they are stepping out into knee-deep mud where they can barely walk, let alone form a battle line.
If you've ever driven the I-95 corridor between Baltimore and Philadelphia, you know exactly the terrain they are slogging through. Imagine doing that in wet wool coats in August.
If Washington's Continental Army had been waiting for them on those bluffs overlooking the Elk River, it would have been an unmitigated disaster for the British.
It would have been a bloodbath. You have guys stuck in the mud, you can't maneuver the ships to provide covering fire. The war could have ended right there.
Without question. Fighting a battle while actively disembarking, with no room to deploy cavalry or articulate artillery, would have been a commander's worst nightmare.
The Howe brothers were incredibly fortunate that their gamble paid off in one specific way.
They had maintained the element of surprise. The Americans were miles away in Pennsylvania and Delaware. They were not on that beach.
So the British stagger onto the land. But calling it land is being generous. The diaries from the Hessian mercenaries, these are professional German soldiers hired by the British.
Guys who are used to the manicured forests and cobblestone roads of Europe.
Exactly. Their accounts paint this incredibly vivid, almost terrifying picture. They step off the boats into a literal sweltering wilderness.
They describe hacking their way through thick woods of sassafras and wild grapevines. But the thing that really gets to them, the detail that shows up in diary after diary, is the wildlife.
They frequently mention the area being infested with massive toads and venomous snakes, which was deeply unsettling for them.
But you're right. The most psychologically striking detail from the Hessian perspective is the sheer noise of the environment.
The cicadas. The diaries refer to them as locusts. If you grew up on the East Coast, you know that sound. In late August, the cicadas in the trees can create this deafening, vibrating hum.
The Hessians wrote that the insects were so oppressively loud that the officers literally couldn't hear each other speak.
Just put yourself in their boots, You've been starving and vomiting in a dark wooden box for 6 weeks. You finally step onto solid ground. It's a sweltering, muddy jungle filled with snakes.
And there is this screeching alien wall of sound pulsing from the trees.
It is deeply disorienting. It strips away any sense of military order. And just to compound their misery, the weather turns violently against them.
On their very first night ashore, August 25th, a massive biblical thunderstorm hits the region.
And remember, because it took so long to unload, the men don't even have their canvas tents yet. The baggage train is still on the ships.
The sources say the soldiers were desperately scrambling around in the dark trying to build these crude Indian corn huts.
Basically tying stalks of local corn together to make lean-tos, just to get some meager shelter from the torrential rain.
And we must emphasize that this rain wasn't just a physical inconvenience. It had severe, immediate tactical consequences.
In 1777, soldiers used paper cartridges, a pre-measured tube of paper holding a lead ball and black powder.
And black powder is highly susceptible to moisture. The storms were so intense that they ruined 16,000 British rifle cartridges.
It destroyed a massive amount of their reserve gunpowder.
Furthermore, the local roads, which were little more than dirt tracks to begin with, completely washed out. They turned into bottomless troughs of mud,
making it entirely impossible to move the heavy bronze artillery that they were still struggling to drag off the beach.
So the grand, invincible British army is literally stuck in the mud, fighting off cicadas and trying to dry out their gunpowder.
And while they are paralyzed for days, Washington is finally getting a clear picture of what is happening. The board is set.
And this leads us to the critical decisions, the close calls, and the profound councils of war that define the American response.
While the British are bogged down at Turkey Point and Head of Elk, Washington is rapidly mobilizing. He has finally located his enemy.
He immediately marches his Continental Army south through the streets of Philadelphia. This was a highly deliberate, highly orchestrated show of force.
He wanted to boost the morale of the capital's citizens, many of whom were panicking, and show them that the army was ready to fight.
From Philadelphia, he moves them quickly south to Wilmington, Delaware.
Wilmington is only about 20 miles away from where the British landed. Washington sets up his main camp there on the evening of August 25th.
The exact same day, the British commanders are abandoning their flagships in the mud, so the armies are suddenly right on top of each other.
But Washington's men are exhausted from forced marches in the summer heat. So Washington calls a council of war with his top generals.
And this council reveals a fascinating fundamental split in military philosophy within the American High Command.
It's one of the most revealing moments of the campaign. According to the primary sources, specifically a detailed account from a British officer who later captured an American aide and heard the story.
The European officers attached to Washington's staff, the seasoned French and German volunteers, were aggressively urging immediate action.
They looked at the intelligence and argued that Washington should strike right then and there.
Their logic is flawless. They are saying, look, the British are seasick, their horses are dead, their gunpowder is soaked, their army is physically divided between the ships and the shore.
Hit them while they're down. It makes total aggressive sense.
It is the textbook application of seizing the initiative. But the native-born American officers fiercely push back against the Europeans.
The Americans counsel patience and preservation. They argue that they should wait, gather more intelligence to determine the exact British numbers.
Rally the local Delaware and Maryland militias to bolster their ranks and eventually force General Howe to attack them on defensive ground that the Americans get to choose.
And Washington listens to the Americans. He actively chooses to wait. Okay, I have to push back on this because reading this part of history is incredibly frustrating.
It is.
The French and German officers are looking at the stark, undeniable reality of the situation. The British are at their absolute weakest. They're stuck in a swamp, disorganized, and half-starved.
Why on earth wouldn't you attack?
Exactly. Was this a massive, historic missed opportunity for the Americans? Could Washington have literally ended the entire Revolutionary War right there on the muddy banks of the Elk River?
It is arguably one of the greatest what-ifs of the entire conflict. If we analyze it from a purely tactical tabletop perspective, a swift, overwhelming strike against a disorganized, vulnerable beachhead is the correct move.
You exploit the enemy's logistical bottleneck. You trap them against the water.
However, to understand why Washington said no, we have to deeply analyze his leadership style, his psychological burden, and his broader strategic imperatives.
Washington was inherently almost painfully conservative when it came to risking the entirety of the Continental Army.
Because he knows he doesn't have a backup army.
Precisely. Washington fundamentally understood that the Continental Army was the revolution. If the army existed, the rebellion existed.
If the army was destroyed, the Continental Congress would scatter, the French would never ally with them, and the war was over.
He looked at the French plan and saw the hidden variables. What if he launched a massive assault into the mud, but the British naval guns on the ships were able to provide more covering fire than anticipated?
What if his own tired, poorly trained troops got bogged down in the swamp and routed?
It's the risk-reward ratio.
Yes. If Washington attacks and fails, the war ends that afternoon. If Howe attacks and fails, Howe just retreats to his ships. The asymmetrical risk is enormous.
Washington favored a Fabian strategy, preserving his army, fighting defensive battles, bleeding the British slowly.
And refusing to take a high-risk gamble unless he had absolute certainty. He wanted to fight the war on his terms, on dry ground behind entrenchments.
He's playing the long game. Okay, I can respect the heavy burden of command, even if it is agonizing to watch them pass up such a vulnerable target.
So instead of ordering an attack, Washington decides he needs eyes on the enemy. He refuses to rely purely on scouts.
On August 26th, he rides out for a personal, highly dangerous reconnaissance mission.
And the entourage he brings with him is a fascinating cross-section of the American leadership.
He rides out with General Nathaniel Greene, who is his most trusted and brilliant tactician.
He brings the young Marquis de Lafayette, the eager French nobleman who has just arrived to fight for glory.
And he brings a newly minted brigadier general named George Wheaton. Let's talk about Wheaton for a second, because his backstory is everything I love about the American Revolution.
He's not some polished, aristocratic European officer.
Right.
The text tells us that George Wheaton was a minor plantation owner in Virginia who ran a tavern near Fredericksburg.
A tavern that George Washington himself was actually a frequent patron of before the war.
Exactly. Wheaton was this loud, outspoken patriot, a tavern keeper who spent his days pouring ale and arguing politics.
When the war broke out, he and his brother-in-law, Hugh Mercer, formed an independent militia company. And now, just a couple of years later, here's the guy who used to pour Washington's drinks.
Riding as a brigadier general alongside the commander-in-chief and a French aristocrat, scouting the vanguard of the British Empire, it's wild.
It perfectly illustrates the diverse, egalitarian, almost ad hoc nature of the American military leadership at this stage of the war. Merit and zeal often trumped formal pedigree.
So this small elite scouting party rides south toward the British lines, and they head to the summit of a place called Iron Hill.
Iron Hill is crucial geography.
It is a massive geological anomaly in the region. It's a prominent iron-rich hill that rises sharply up from the otherwise flat, sandy coastal plain of Delaware.
From the summit of Iron Hill, you have a commanding panoramic view of the surrounding countryside.
They ride to the top, look through their spyglasses, and they can actually see the canvas tents of the British encampment sprawling out near Head of Elk.
They're looking right at the beast. But then, Washington does something that is so incredibly risky, it borders on reckless.
A severe, violent rainstorm rolls in. Remember, the weather this entire week is atrocious.
Instead of riding back to the safety of the massive American camp in Wilmington, Washington, his top generals and a tiny cavalry escort decide to take shelter in a nearby farmhouse for the night.
This action cannot be overstated in its danger. This was a monumental, potentially war-ending risk. Washington is entirely separated from his main army.
He is sleeping in an isolated farmhouse with just a handful of guards, practically in the shadow of the British encampments.
We have to remember the context of the region. This area of Maryland and Delaware was swarming with British cavalry patrols, Hessian jägers, and local loyalist informants who would love nothing more than to betray the rebel commander.
If one local farmer recognized him and slipped through the woods to the British camp.
Exactly. A quick, silent cavalry raid in the middle of the night could have easily captured the commander-in-chief, the brightest tactical mind in Nathaniel Greene, and the Marquis de Lafayette, all in one swoop.
And it's not like that was a paranoid fear. The exact same thing had almost destroyed the American army the year before.
General Charles Lee, who was Washington's second-in-command at the time, decided to sleep in a tavern away from his army in New Jersey.
The British found out, surrounded the tavern, and dragged him out in his nightgown. Washington knew exactly how dangerous this was.
But Washington's legendary luck holds. The storm provides cover, no one betrays them, and they ride out at dawn unharmed.
And here is the truly craziest, almost cinematic detail of that reconnaissance mission. Later that exact same day, after the Americans have left, British General William Howe is advancing his lines.
He rides up to that exact same farmhouse and establishes his own temporary command post there.
They missed each other by hours. The two commanders-in-chief slept under the same roof on the same day.
It really highlights how incredibly fluid, chaotic, and unpredictable the front lines were in this campaign. There were no static trenches yet. It was a deadly game of hide and seek.
And there's a moment documented in the diary of the Hessian captain Munchausen that feels like it belongs in a movie.
It's one of the most iconic primary source accounts we have of the commanders. Munchausen writes that later in the week, he and several senior British officers were standing on a ridge, observing a wooded hill opposite their position.
Through the trees, they spotted a group of American officers conducting their own scouting.
Munchausen notes the colorful uniforms. Some officers were in the bright blue and white of the Continental Regulars, others in blue and red.
But his attention was drawn to one specific officer, positioned slightly apart, dressed very unobtrusively in a plain, unadorned gray coat.
And this man was standing completely still, carefully watching the British lines through a spyglass.
The officers around Munchausen, who had served in America before the war, who knew Washington personally, took one look through their own glasses and insisted that the tall man in the plain gray coat was George Washington himself.
It is a striking image. The two commanders, Washington and Howe, were essentially staring at each other across the hills of Delaware, quietly trying to read each other's minds and divine the other's strategy.
It's a quiet, tense moment of high-stakes chess. But while the generals are playing this intellectual game on the hilltops, the actual piece is on the board.
Thousands of miserable, starving soldiers.
Right. They're operating in a state of absolute vicious chaos down in the valleys. And this brings us to the fascinating, bloody paradox of plunder and pacification.
This is a crucial dynamic to understand about the reality of an occupying 18th century army. General Howe is a political creature as much as a military one.
He understands that he is not just trying to defeat an army. He is trying to pacify a rebellion and return the populace to the British fold.
So he issues incredibly strict, formal declarations.
He literally brought a functioning printing press on one of the ships. As soon as they land, on August 27th, he fires at the press and starts churning out these broadsides,
offering amnesty and a general pardon to any rebels who surrender their weapons and swear allegiance to King George.
He is desperately trying to win the hearts and minds of the locals.
He publicly promises to protect the peaceable inhabitants from any depredations, theft, or violence by his army. He wants to be seen as the benevolent, lawful liberator, restoring the king's peace to a chaotic land.
Right, that's the official PR campaign. But there is a massive, violent disconnect between Howe's printing press and the grim reality of 17,000 starving men.
Howe simultaneously has to issue internal military orders threatening the immediate execution of any British or Hessian soldier caught plundering civilian property.
The contradiction is stark and ultimately impossible to manage. Howe wants perfect discipline, but human hunger easily overrides military law.
You have to look at the psychology of the enlisted men. These soldiers have been locked in the rotting hulls of ships for 6 weeks. They have been eating hardtack infested with weevils and drinking foul water.
They finally land, expecting supplies, but their supply wagons are stuck in the mud. They are released into a seemingly hostile, incredibly fertile agricultural landscape.
When the commanders send the Hessian jägers out to patrol the perimeter, they aren't just looking for American ambushes, they are desperately, actively hunting for food.
The jägers were the elite green-coated sharpshooters, right? Guys who used to be professional foresters and gamekeepers in Germany.
The primary sources say these highly trained snipers were creeping through the Delaware woods, using their expensive write-ups to shoot oxen, sheep, and local turkeys just to survive.
And the physical toll was horrific.
Yeah.
The heat was so oppressive, the humidity so thick, that the diaries record several of the jägers actually collapsing.
Falling dead from heat stroke just trying to hunt livestock in the midday sun. That is how brutal and unforgiving the conditions were.
And when men are pushed to that level of desperation, the thin veneer of military discipline completely shatters.
It gets really dark, really fast. The locals aren't just dealing with polite soldiers asking for flour. Captain John Andre, a famous British officer, noted in his diary that a, quote, deal of plunder was committed by the troops despite the strictest prohibitions from General Howe.
The violence escalated rapidly, from simple theft to physical brutality. The historical text mentions an agonizing account of a British soldier who was accused of attacking a local woman.
And literally chopping off her fingers with a knife just to steal her wedding rings. That is the horrific ground-level reality of an invading army.
And you can imagine the local colonial population, many of whom might have been neutral or even slightly loyalist before the invasion, they don't just sit back and let their families be attacked.
No, they fight back, and they fight back viciously. The retaliation from the local populace was swift, stealthy, and brutal.
On August 31st, a British officer recorded the grim discovery of 2 British regular soldiers lying dead on the side of a dirt road, their throats slit from ear to ear.
A few days later, 2 other massive British grenadiers were found hanging from trees in the woods. The local farmers and the unorganized militia were essentially engaging in a spontaneous, bloody guerrilla war against the British foraging parties.
It is total localized chaos. And it wasn't just the British causing havoc. Washington was absolutely furious because his own Continental soldiers were doing the exact same thing.
On September 4th, the sources record Washington going on a massive, angry rant to his officers, issuing a general order threatening his own men with no mercy, no trial, if they were caught plundering the local civilians.
It perfectly illustrates the tragic reality for the non-combatants. If you were a local farmer in Delaware or Maryland in 1777, it didn't really matter what color the uniform was.
The bright red of the British, the green of the Hessians, or the blue and brown of the Americans.
If an army showed up at your farm, it meant your winter crops were gone, your fence rails were burned for firewood, your livestock was slaughtered, and your family's life was in immediate danger.
It's a profoundly sobering reality. This chaotic environment of scouting, violent foraging, and brutal small-scale guerrilla skirmishes was inevitably pulling the 2 massive armies closer and closer together.
Like a gravitational pull. And that unavoidable collision finally happens as the British slowly force their way out of the Maryland mud and cross the border into Delaware.
Which brings us to the first major tactical engagement of the campaign. The Battle of Cooch's Bridge, also known in some records as the Battle of Iron Hill, fought on September 3rd, 1777.
This is a huge deal for local history because it is the absolutely only battle fought on Delaware soil during the entire span of the American Revolution.
To understand how the battle unfolds, we have to set the tactical stage. The British vanguard has finally managed to dry their powder, extract their artillery from the mud, and begin moving in a massive, slow column from Head of Elk toward the roads leading to Philadelphia.
Washington knows they are coming. He desperately needs to accomplish 2 things. He needs to slow their advance to buy time to build his main defenses, and he needs to test their fighting strength.
He needs a speed bump, but a very sharp, deadly speed bump. So he creates a specialized elite strike force.
He orders his commanders to pull 100 of the best marksmen and riflemen from each of his 7 Continental brigades.
He combines them into a temporary elite regiment of 700 men under the command of General William Maxwell. He reinforces them with about 300 local militia fighters who know the woods.
And he places this 1,000-man force at a brilliant strategic bottleneck, Cooch's Bridge.
It is a textbook defensive choke point. Cooch's Bridge is exactly what it sounds like. A wooden bridge where the main road crosses the muddy Christina River, situated right at the foot of the heavily wooded Iron Hill.
The Americans hold the high ground in the dense trees on the hill, and the British have to funnel themselves down the narrow road and cross a constricted bridge over a river to get to them. It's perfect.
And the battle that erupts here completely destroys this stubborn, incredibly persistent myth we have about how the Revolutionary War was fought.
You're referring to the Hollywood depiction.
Yes. The idea that the British were these rigid, arrogant fools who politely stood shoulder to shoulder in bright red rows in an open green field, while the clever, scrappy Americans hid behind rocks and trees and picked them off.
Right. It's a pervasive myth, but if we connect the tactics of Cooch's Bridge to the bigger picture of military history, this battle proves conclusively that both sides were highly capable of adapting to the brutal realities of the North American terrain.
The leading edge of the massive British advance, the troops who made first contact with the Americans in the woods, were not the standard redcoats. They were the Hessian jägers.
Let's do a quick deep dive on the jägers, because the technology they used completely changed the fight. Most soldiers in this war carried a smoothbore musket, like the British Brown Bess.
Correct. A smoothbore musket is essentially a lead ball bouncing down a smooth metal pipe. It is completely inaccurate beyond 50 or 75 yards. You don't aim a musket, you point a wall of muskets at another wall of men and fire a volley.
But the Jägers were different. As we mentioned, these were professional foresters from the German states. They wore dark green coats, specifically designed to blend into the foliage. And they were armed with the Jaeger rifle.
A rifle, meaning the inside of the barrel has spiral grooves cut into it.
Exactly. When the weapon is fired, Those grooves grip the late ball and impart a spin, exactly like a quarterback throwing a perfect spiral football.
This aerodynamic stability meant a Jaeger rifle could hit a man-sized target accurately at 200 or even 300 yards.
But the trade-off is the reload time. Because the ball has to fit tightly into those grooves, you essentially have to hammer the bullet down the barrel with a mallet.
It takes much longer to load than a loose-fitting musket ball. So you have American frontiersmen with their long rifles, hiding in the woods of Iron Hill, engaging in a sniper duel with German gamekeepers with their short rifles, hiding in the brush below.
And the Hessian diaries describe these German professionals fighting exactly the way we traditionally picture the Americans fighting. They were not standing in lines.
They were crawling on their bellies through the thick underbrush, using massive oak trees for cover, taking highly calculated, deliberate shots at the flashes of gunpowder in the hills above them.
It evolved into a vicious, running, tree-to-tree firefight through the dense woods that lasted for 7 grueling hours.
7 hours of constant stress. And the fighting got incredibly intimate and violent.
Captain Johann Ewald, the commander of the Jägers, noted in his journal that as they pushed up the hill into the American lines, the combat got so close and desperate that there wasn't time to use that slow, complicated rifle reloading process.
They were frequently drawing their short, heavy hunting swords and engaging the Americans in brutal hand-to-hand combat in the bushes.
The visceral reality of the violence is staggering. Captain Munchausen's diary contains these tragic, deeply human details that abruptly strip away the romance of the revolution and leave you staring at the sheer horror of ground-level combat.
His diary entry from this day just stops you in your tracks. He talks about riding forward to observe the firefight alongside a young, handsome, highly regarded 18-year-old English engineering officer named Haldane.
They're sitting on their horses, watching the smoke in the trees, and suddenly a stray bullet flies out of the woods and completely shatters Haldane's right arm.
We have to remember the state of 18th century combat medicine. A shattered bone from a massive low-velocity lead musket ball could not be repaired. Infection was a certainty.
Munchausen calmly notes that the young engineer's arm had to be amputated by a field surgeon later that very evening.
Likely with no anesthetic beyond a bite of leather and a shot of rum.
It's horrifying. And Munchausen also recounts another deeply haunting moment. As the British slowly push the Americans back, Munchausen rides past a mortally wounded American captain lying bleeding in the dirt.
The dying American looks up at his enemy, Munchausen, and begs him for a drink of water.
Munchausen records that he didn't have his canteen, but he promised the dying man he would ride to find some and return.
When the Hessian captain hurries back with the water a short time later, the American officer is already dead. It is a stark reminder that beneath the grand strategic maneuvers, the cost was paid by thousands of young men bleeding out in the mud.
It's heartbreaking. But pulling back up to the tactical level, while this intense sniper duel is happening in the woods, the British command actually makes a massive, almost comical blunder.
General Howe is frustrated by the delay. He doesn't want to fight a 7-hour sniper battle. So he tries to rely on his favorite trick. He attempts a flanking maneuver.
He orders a full battalion of elite British light infantry to sweep far around the right side, bypass the bridge entirely, and attack the Americans from the rear.
It's a sound tactical concept on paper, but Howe failed to account for the treacherous local geography. He sends his highly trained, fast-moving light infantry marching directly off the map into an impassable, deep, sucking quagmire known locally as Purgatory Swamp.
Purgatory Swamp. You literally cannot invent a better name for a military disaster.
It is entirely fitting. The entire British flanking force, hundreds of men, gets hopelessly bogged down. They are sinking past their knees in the mud, their heavy equipment is dragging them down, and they are completely immobilized.
They cannot advance, they cannot engage the enemy, and they spend the entire battle just trying to extract themselves from the muck. The Hessian Jägers are left to fight the Americans entirely alone for hours.
And here is where the battle gets really interesting. The Americans are actually winning, or at least they are holding their own perfectly.
They have the high ground on Iron Hill, they have excellent tree cover, and they are inflicting severe casualties on the elite German troops while the British infantry is stuck in a swamp.
They fight ferociously for 7 hours, but then they retreat. And they don't retreat because they are outmaneuvered. They don't retreat because their lines break or they panic.
Why do they finally give up the hill?
It comes down to logistics once again. The American riflemen simply ran out of bullets. Because Washington had quickly assembled this temporary strike force from various brigades, and because they were meant to be a fast-moving, lightly equipped unit, They did not carry sufficient reserve ammunition for a sustained all-day high-volume firefight.
They literally shot every piece of lead they had, emptied their powder horns, and realized they had nothing left to throw but rocks. So General Maxwell orders a retreat.
And they execute it well. They fall back in relatively good, disciplined order, leaving the woods and marching north to rejoin Washington's main defensive lines.
The British eventually push over Cooch's Bridge and take the summit of Iron Hill. So technically, by 18th century military standards, it is a British victory because they claim the physical ground.
Yes, the British held the field. But tactically and psychologically, it was arguably a draw or even a slight American victory.
Washington's strike force accomplished its exact mission. They severely delayed the British advance, they tested the enemy's resolve, and the American troops proved to themselves that they could stand toe-to-toe in the woods for 7 hours against the most feared elite marksmen in the European arsenal without breaking.
It was a massive confidence boost for the Continental Army. Following the battle, the exhausted British Army finally crosses the river and sets up a massive camp.
General Howe establishes his headquarters at a place called Aiken's Tavern in the nearby village of Glasgow. And his second-in-command, Lord Cornwallis, requisitions the large brick mill house owned by the Cooch family right near the bridge.
And there is a wonderful piece of local historical lore mentioned in the Kaufman and Gallagher text regarding that occupation.
Oh, I love this story. So years later, Mr. Ned Cooch, a direct descendant of the family who owned the house during the battle, noted in a historical forum that when Lord Cornwallis and the British officers took over their home, they essentially discovered the family's extensive private liquor cellar.
And over the course of the occupation, the British High Command drank the Cooch family's entire supply of booze. But the family got the last laugh.
To this day, as a tiny permanent act of historical revenge, a large painting depicting Lord Cornwallis's humiliating final surrender to Washington at Yorktown hangs prominently over the fireplace mantel in the historic Cooch house.
It's a fantastic, very human connection to the physical space. But as the British drink the last of the Cooch family's liquor, the stage is irreversibly set.
The British have forced their way out of Maryland and are fully entrenched in Delaware. Washington knows exactly where they are, he knows their strength, and he has to make his ultimate stand to protect Philadelphia.
This leads us directly to the grand clash of strategies. Washington's massive defensive preparations and General Howe's absolutely brilliant, infuriating feint.
Following the action at Cooch's Bridge, Washington pulls his entire Continental Army back a few miles north to a prominent geographical feature called Red Clay Creek, near the small towns of Newport and Stanton, Delaware.
He decides this is where he will break the British Army. He orders his men to dig in, and they construct a massive, elaborate, triangular defensive earthwork.
They are felling trees, digging deep trenches, throwing up earthen walls, and carefully positioning their artillery batteries to create overlapping fields of fire across the creek. He is ready for the ultimate, decisive showdown.
But it's really important to note that this was a highly controversial decision within the American command. General Nathaniel Greene, who we mentioned earlier as Washington's best tactical mind, vehemently argued against this plan.
Greene had looked at the map and passionately insisted that the Americans should have made their primary all-or-nothing stand much further south, right at the Christina River and Iron Hill, the very area they had just retreated from.
Greene believed the steep, rugged terrain and the river bottlenecks down there were vastly superior for a defense. But Washington, perhaps worried about being trapped against the Delaware River, overruled his best general, choosing the Red Clay Creek line instead.
It's a decision historians still debate. But regardless of Greene's objections, Washington is fully committed. He is so profoundly convinced that this is the defining moment of the entire war that he issues a formal general order to his troops.
And the language he uses is breathtaking. It is practically Shakespearean in its emotional weight.
I want to read a specific piece of this order because the rhetoric is just incredibly powerful. He is trying to forge an iron will in these tired men. He tells the army, "They will put the contest on the event of a single battle. If they are overthrown, they are utterly undone. The war is at an end. One bold stroke will free the land from rapine, devastations and burnings, and female innocence from brutal lust and violence."
And then he delivers the ultimate ultimatum. He literally writes, "If we behave like men, this third campaign will be our last."
It is a phenomenal, masterfully crafted piece of psychological motivation. Washington is deliberately framing this as an apocalyptic, all-or-nothing final battle.
He is telling them they are no longer just fighting for abstract political concepts like liberty or taxation. He is grounding the fight in visceral reality. They are fighting to protect their own families, their wives, and their daughters from the very real, horrific brutality that they have all watched the British foragers commit over the past 2 weeks.
He raises the emotional stakes to the absolute maximum. So the American soldiers are incredibly pumped up. The adrenaline is surging. They are standing in their deep trenches.
They've checked their flints, their muskets are loaded, the artillerymen have their matches burning, the alarm guns go off in the distance, they see movement in the trees across the creek. The moment of destiny has arrived.
And what does General Howe do? He executes the ultimate humiliating juke.
This is where General Howe's true tactical cunning, his absolute mastery of battlefield manipulation, shines through. Howe has scouts, too. He knows exactly where Washington is, and he knows that the American army is heavily entrenched behind massive earthworks at Red Clay Creek.
Howe knows that ordering a direct frontal assault across a creek into fortified cannons would be suicidal. It would be a slaughter.
So, on the morning of September 9th, Howe initiates a brilliant deception. He takes a relatively small, highly visible detachment of his troops and sends them marching directly toward a place called Milltown, which is situated directly in front of Washington's formidable defenses.
This small detachment marches up, they fan out, they light massive campfires, they beat their drums loudly, they make a tremendous amount of noise.
They are deliberately trying to look like the vanguard of the entire British army preparing for a massive assault. They are basically standing on Washington's front porch, ringing the doorbell repeatedly and shouting.
Exactly. They successfully pin Washington's attention firmly in place. They make the American commander completely believe that the grand apocalyptic attack he prepared for is imminent.
But while Washington is entirely focused on the noise at Milltown, Howe takes the vast, overwhelming majority of his 17,000-man army, silently breaks camp in the middle of the night, and sneaks them entirely out the back door.
It is so brilliant, and if you are Washington, it is absolutely infuriating. Washington spends weeks building this massive, perfect defensive wall. He gives a speech worthy of a Hollywood movie climax. He has his men ready to die.
And Howe just quietly walks away and goes around the wall. It's the Long Island flank all over again. And the route Howe takes to pull this off is completely fascinating. It's a masterclass in exploiting terrain.
On the early morning of September 8th, hours before dawn, the massive British army begins this sweeping flanking maneuver to the north.
And the historical sources note an incredibly surreal atmospheric detail about this moment. The soldiers broke their camps and began their silent march under the eerie, shimmering glow of a remarkable borealis, the Northern Lights.
Think about how cinematic that is. Imagine being a colonial farmer, waking up in the middle of the night to see the sky glowing with the northern lights, which is rare enough in Delaware, and then looking out your window to see 17,000 heavily armed enemy troops silently marching through your backyard in the colorful dark.
And they march right through the heart of Newark, Delaware. Today, Newark is the bustling home of the University of Delaware, a massive college town. But back in 1777, it was a small, quiet village.
And as the British approached, it was mostly deserted. The terrified locals had packed whatever they could carry and fled into the woods.
The few residents who did bravely or stubbornly stay behind left us with some incredibly striking visual memories of the occupation. Because elements of the British Army were camped on the elevated slopes of Iron Hill just outside town, the residents of Newark recalled seeing the soldiers' silhouettes cast by the massive campfires.
The angle of the light stretching down the hill made the shadows of the soldiers stretch 30 feet tall against the trees. It must have looked to the locals like an army of literal giants descending upon their homes.
It's an intimidating, terrifying image. But the march through the college town wasn't completely peaceful. The text notes this amazing little detail.
As the massive British columns marched past the brick building of the Newark Academy, they took fire. A small group of local cobblers who were working late in a nearby shoe factory looked out the window, saw the entire British Empire marching down Main Street, grabbed their muskets, and actually opened fire on the troops.
It is a remarkably brave, or perhaps completely foolish, act of defiance by civilians. The British vanguard immediately returned fire on the shoe factory.
Fortunately, no casualties were reported on either side from the exchange, and the British commanders, eager to maintain the speed of their flanking maneuver, ordered the army to ignore the cobblers and keep moving.
They didn't have time to stop for a few angry shoemakers, but the troops did have a sense of humor, or at least a penchant for petty vandalism.
The Kaufman and Gallagher book notes that as the army passed Simonton's massive flour mill, situated on the White Clay Creek just outside town, some mischievous soldiers broke in. They didn't burn it down, but they diverted the water, turned on the heavy machinery, and left the massive stone millstones grinding completely empty against each other for 12 straight hours.
It's a detail that humanizes the invading force. It reminds us that these were often bored, cynical young men looking for small ways to leave their mark on the landscape. But the geography of the specific march north from Newark is critical to understanding the campaign.
As they move north, they are fundamentally transitioning out of the flat, sandy, easily traversable coastal plain. They are entering the Piedmont region.
The foothills. The terrain suddenly gets incredibly steep, heavily wooded, and choked with rocky ravines.
Yes. The road forces the army to march into a frightening, narrow defile, a steep valley cut by a waterway known as Jenny's Run.
And Hessian Captain Ewald, the veteran commander of the Jägers, provides a chilling, highly professional account of this terrain. He wrote in his diary that his hair literally stood on end as he led his men into this narrow, rocky gorge.
Because he realized instantly that they were trapped, they were sitting ducks.
Precisely. Ewald, looking at it with the eye of a sniper, noted that the precipitous rocks on either side of the road were so steep and commanding that a mere 100 American riflemen, properly positioned on the heights above, could have rained down fire, held up the entire 17,000-man British army for an entire day, and inflicted massive, disproportionate casualties.
The British artillery couldn't elevate to hit them, and the infantry couldn't climb the rocks fast enough to stop them.
Ewald was utterly astounded that Washington and his generals had completely abandoned this natural, perfect checkpoint to go sit in their man-made trenches miles away at Red Clay Creek.
It is a damning indictment. It really emphasizes how General Howe's massive gamble paid off and how dangerously rigid Washington's thinking was at that specific moment. Washington was so focused on the battle he wanted to fight that he ignored the terrain that would have given him the advantage.
And as the British push through these terrifying hills, the desperation and the plundering continue. There's a famous, poignant local legend mentioned in the text about a family heirloom known as the Hessian plate.
It's a deeply resonant story from an area called Mill Creek Hundred. The local lore states that a group of Hessian marauders, operating on the fringes of the marching column, brutally sacked an ancient established farmhouse along Pike Creek.
The soldiers were ruthless. They smashed all the wooden furniture into kindling, destroyed the family's pottery and tools, and basically ruined the family's entire livelihood in a matter of minutes.
But for some completely inexplicable reason, amidst all this violence and destruction, they left a single, delicate, blue and white porcelain plate, entirely untouched, sitting perfectly in the center of a table.
It makes no sense. Was it a moment of guilt? A weird superstition, we'll never know. But 150 years later, well into the 20th century, the descendants of that Delaware family still carefully cherish that single surviving piece of china, passing it down through generations as the Hessian plate.
It's these tiny, highly specific human details that survive centuries and connect us to the trauma of 1777. But the British Army as a whole cannot stop to admire porcelain or burn every farm. They are pushing incredibly hard to complete their grand flanking maneuver before Washington realizes what is happening.
To navigate the increasingly difficult roadless terrain of the Piedmont efficiently, General Howe makes a critical logistical decision. He splits his massive army into two separate parallel columns.
Lord Cornwallis takes the right column, marching east through the scenic Caucason Valley. General Knyphausen, the Hessian commander, takes the left column, moving further west through the New Garden area, and he is tasked with guarding the massive, slow-moving, heavy baggage train, the supplies, and the bulk of the artillery.
They are completely looping around the back of Washington's entire defensive line. But splitting your army and marching at night in totally unfamiliar, heavily wooded territory inevitably leads to lethal confusion.
There's this bizarre and utterly tragic friendly fire incident that occurs in the dark.
Yes, on the tense night of September 9th, General Howe, traveling with one column, needs to coordinate with the other. So he sends a Scottish captain named Campbell riding forward as a lone courier to locate Knyphausen's column in the pitch black.
Unfortunately, Captain Campbell rides straight down a dark road and runs directly into a forward patrol of British riflemen commanded by Major Patrick Ferguson. Because of the complex maneuvers, neither British group expects the other to be operating in that specific sector.
And in the darkness, under the extreme stress of a night march behind enemy lines, everyone panics. The riflemen hear a horse approaching, they don't recognize the uniform in the dark, and they open fire. Captain Campbell is fatally shot in the belly by his own side's elite riflemen.
He dies in agony hours later. It's a brutal, senseless reminder of the fog of war. Even the most brilliant strategic plans dissolve into chaos in the dark woods.
Meanwhile, as the sun rises, the rest of the army realizes they're moving through a very unique cultural landscape. The area around Hockessin and New Garden was heavily populated by the Society of Friends, the Quakers.
The Quakers maintained a strict, religiously mandated pacifism and neutrality during the Revolutionary War. They refused to fight for the Americans, and they refused to fight for the British.
It must have been an incredibly surreal experience for both the soldiers and the farmers. General Howe actually rides up and makes his temporary headquarters at the Hockessin Friends Meeting House, the center of the local Quaker community.
And the locals, adhering to their pacifist beliefs, don't shoot at him like the cobblers in Newark. They actually provide food and supplies to the invading army because their religion forbids them from taking up arms to stop them.
There are memoirs from these Quaker families recalling how General Howe stood on their property, looked out over the beautiful, rolling green farmland of the Hockessin Valley, and casually remarked that the landscape deeply reminded him of his native Yorkshire in England.
It is a striking juxtaposition. He is calmly admiring the pastoral beauty of the landscape, while his massive war machine is simultaneously preparing for what will be the largest, bloodiest battle of the entire Revolution.
And the physical footprint that his army left behind in those quiet gardens was literal and lasting. The text notes a fascinating archaeological discovery from the 1950s. The owners of the historic Strathworth Mansion in Hockessin, which the British had temporarily commandeered and used as a field hospital, were digging up some old, overgrown boxwood hedges in their yard.
Tangled deep in the root systems, they unearthed buried brass belt buckles, rusted bayonets, and rifle parts.
The detritus of war, literally buried in the flower beds. It's amazing. So, pushing through the Quaker farms on September 10th, the two massive British columns, Cornwallis on the right, Neffhausen on the left, finally converge and reunite at a town called Kennett Square, just across the border in Pennsylvania.
General Howe's grand gamble has worked. He has successfully marched 17,000 men entirely around Washington's right side without firing a major shot.
And this specific moment on September 10th is the moment of terrible, stomach-dropping realization for George Washington. He is still sitting in his beautiful, elaborate, heavily fortified trenches at Red Clay Creek.
He has been waiting for 2 days for a massive frontal assault that is never, ever coming. Finally, his exhausted cavalry scouts ride frantically into camp and deliver the devastating intelligence. The entire British army is miles to his north, casually resting in Kennett Square.
They are physically closer to the capital, Philadelphia, than Washington is. Howe has completely bypassed the Continental Army. I mean, think about a time in your own life when you spent weeks carefully laying out a complex project, obsessing over every single detail, convinced you have everything perfectly controlled, only to have the fundamental parameters completely change at the last possible second, rendering your work useless.
Now multiply that panic by the fate of an entire nation.
Washington's strategic paradigm collapses in an instant. He realizes that if he stays in his trenches, Howe will simply march unopposed into Philadelphia. He has to throw out weeks of meticulous planning.
In the middle of the night, Washington abandons his perfect earthworks, pulls his exhausted, confused army out of the trenches, and orders them to race frantically north toward a crossing on the Brandywine River called Chad's Ford. He is desperately trying to run fast enough to get back in front of Howe's advancing juggernaut.
And that desperate, chaotic scramble sets the physical stage for the massive Battle of the Brandywine the very next day on September 11th. We won't cover the tactical blow-by-blow of Brandywine here, but the result is well known. It is a massive, crushing defeat for Washington.
General Howe uses another flanking maneuver, rolls up the American lines, wins a decisive victory, and a few weeks later, he triumphantly marches his army into Philadelphia. The American capital falls to the British Empire.
Which brings us to the ultimate necessary historical reckoning of this entire campaign. From a micro perspective, looking solely at the map of Pennsylvania, it appears that General Howe was a tactical genius, and his grueling 500-mile detour completely succeeded. He outmaneuvered Washington, won the battle, and captured the prize city.
Right. He got exactly what he wanted. He sits in Philadelphia all winter while Washington freezes at Valley Forge. So Howe wins, right?
This raises the most critical macro-historical question of the war. Did Howe's 500-mile detour actually work for the British Empire? On the tactical level, yes. But if we connect this campaign to the broader continental strategic picture of 1777, Howe's obsession with Philadelphia was an unmitigated disaster that ultimately cost the British the war.
Wait, how does capturing the enemy's capital cost you the war? That sounds contradictory.
It comes down to the most unforgiving resource in warfare, time. Think about the sheer number of weeks General Howe deliberately wasted. He wasted weeks loading ships in New York. He wasted a month sweating and starving in the Chesapeake Bay. He wasted weeks slogging through the mud at Head of Elk, fighting the skirmish at Cooch's Bridge, and slowly marching through the Delaware hills. All of that precious time meant his massive 17,000-man army was entirely consumed, geographically isolated, and bogged down in the Southern theater.
And what was happening simultaneously in the Northern theater?
While Howe was fighting cicadas in Maryland, another major British army, commanded by Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne, was executing the grand strategic plan of the empire. Burgoyne was marching a massive force down from Canada, pushing through the dense wilderness of upstate New York. The grand, coordinated British strategy was supposed to be a multi-pronged attack to physically cut off the rebellious New England colonies from the rest of America. To succeed, Burgoyne desperately, urgently needed General Howe to march his army north up the Hudson River to meet him and crush the Americans between them.
But Howe couldn't march north to the Hudson. He was hundreds of miles away, stuck in the Delaware mud, playing cat and mouse with Washington at Red Clay Creek and fighting at the Brandywine. He was completely hopelessly out of position to offer any support to the Northern Army.
Exactly. Because General Howe was entirely obsessed with his personal glory, capturing Philadelphia via this incredibly convoluted, time-consuming southern route, General Burgoyne was left entirely isolated in the forests of New York. The American forces swarmed around Burgoyne. Just 1 month after Howe took Philadelphia in October 1777, Burgoyne's starving, surrounded army was forced to unconditionally surrender at the Battle of Saratoga.
Saratoga. If you know your history, Saratoga is the absolute turning point of the whole war. That is the massive, shocking American victory that finally convinced the King of France that the Americans could actually win. That surrender brings the mighty French Navy, massive amounts of French money, and thousands of French troops directly into the war on the American side. And that French alliance is what ultimately secures American independence at Yorktown years later.
Precisely. General Howe won his brilliant tactical battle in Pennsylvania, and he got his winter in Philadelphia. But the weeks he willingly lost in the miserable swamps of Maryland and the rocky hills of Delaware ultimately condemned Burgoyne, brought the French into the war, and cost the British Empire the American colonies. It is the ultimate Pyrrhic victory.
That is absolutely mind-blowing. The sheer unpredictable ripple effects of history. The fact that a decision to avoid some wooden spikes in a river led to the birth of a nation. Okay, let's bring this home. We have covered an incredibly dense, fascinating journey today. We started with that miserable, sweltering, muddy landing at Head of Elk, where the greatest army on Earth was paralyzed by thunderstorms and deafening insects. We traced the brutal, intimate, hand-to-hand combat at Cooch's Bridge, the only battle in Delaware, where American riflemen fought until their guns were literally empty while the British floundered in Purgatory Swamp.
We examined Washington's desperate Shakespearean psychological attempt to hold the line at his massive Red Clay Creek trenches, and we watched General Howe execute a masterful, stealthy night march through the abandoned college town of Newark, bypassing those defenses entirely under the surreal glow of the Northern Lights.
And it all culminated in that desperate, panicked foot race to the Brandywine, a brilliant tactical victory for the British that accidentally sowed the seeds of their ultimate, world-altering defeat at Saratoga. But before we sign off, I want to leave you, our listener, with a final lingering what-if to mull over. We talked extensively about General Nathaniel Greene.
Yes, Washington's most trusted, strategically minded commander who vehemently advised against building those elaborate defenses at Red Clay Creek.
Right. Greene looked at the map and wanted to make the grand American stand further south, right at the rocky slopes of Iron Hill and the muddy banks of the Christina River. The very place where the British light infantry actually got stuck in the swamp during the skirmish. Think about that terrifying, narrow defile at Jenny's Run that made the hair stand up on the back of the Hessian sniper's neck. What if Washington had put aside his conservatism? What if he had listened to Greene? What if he used that rugged, rocky terrain and the natural bottleneck of Cooch's Bridge to trap the sprawling, sluggish British army while they were still struggling with their massive baggage trains and artillery in the mud?
It is a profound, tantalizing counterfactual to consider. Could the natural geography of Delaware, the swamps, the hills, the narrow ravines, have turned a modest tactical delay into a decisive war-ending American victory? Could they have crushed Howe's army against the river, entirely preventing the fall of Philadelphia, and perhaps ending the war years earlier? We will never definitively know, but the landscape was undeniably primed for it.
It really makes you look at those quiet streams, those rolling hills, and those old stone farmhouses differently. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the hidden, muddy history of the American Revolution. The next time you are driving up the highway past a muddy riverbank or walking through a quiet, historic college town, just remember, history isn't always a clean, elegant chess match. Sometimes the most consequential, world-altering moments happen right there in the mud while the rain pours down and the cicadas scream in the trees. Keep exploring, and we'll see you on the next deep dive.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the Uncharted Lancaster podcast. If you enjoyed the episode, be sure to subscribe and leave a rating or review wherever you listen. It really helps more people discover the show. For more fascinating local history, visit unchartedlancaster.com. And if you'd like to go deeper, check out one of Adam Zern's books at unchartedlancaster.com/books. Until next time, keep exploring.